in what has to be the best article ever published in an educational journal. Okay, this is very high praise, the best article ever published in an educational journal. Cognitive scientists Mike and Anne Nishioka Eisenberg give real pedagogical force to this reflective moment. Okay, draw out its theoretical implications, and the title of theirs is Shop Class for the Next Millennium, Education Through Computer-Enriched Handicrafts. And their observation is kind of a pretty interesting one. It's where the computer's computational skills for crafting draw conclusions, show things as possible that are not actually possible. It's origami, right? And origami is the folding of paper. And in a computer simulation, you can fold and fold and fold infinitely, really, because the paper isn't paper. It doesn't have true dimension. It doesn't have true tension. It doesn't have true porousness, sharpness, solidness, whatever. So sure, in the computer program, you can make things that are actually not possible in the real world because of the limitations of the paper. Paper has a thickness. So this is to show students the difference between creating something in a virtual world and creating something in real life. We need to have an understanding of materials and know how they work in order to make things in the physical world. And it was called hypergami, as in origami, but hyper in the virtual world. We ran into situations where the program provided us with a folding that was mathematically correct, that is, technically correct unfolding of the desired solid, but otherwise disastrous. So that's the figure that they're talking about. And he draws the conclusion, I take their point to be, meaning he's drawing a conclusion that the Eisenbergs did not state, that the crafting problem is in fact not reducible to an algorithmic problem. More precisely, any algorithmic solution to the crafting problem cannot itself be generated algorithmically. It's ironic, isn't it? It must include the constraints, right? Paper is a real physical thing that there are limits to how many times you can fold it or unfold it, that you can only know through practice. Only the people who do origami can know what can be done with a piece of paper. Through embodied manipulations, right? The real physical times that they manipulate the paper, that they fold it, that they turn it, that they twist it, and so forth. These constraints cannot be arrived at deductively. You have to do it. You can't know what can be done until you do it. That's the way the physical world works, actually. Okay, and then he gives us another example of his own. Following graduate school in Chicago, he took a job in Washington, D.C. in a think tank. So here, obviously, he's going to give us another example of the difference between his worlds of work. He hated working in the think tank, and so he left and he opened a motorcycle repair shop. How opposite can you get from working in a pure brain space to working in a motorcycle repair shop, which we would think of as a physical space, right? A physical space where handwork is done, Richmond, Virginia, and not too far from D.C. When I would come home from the work, my wife would sniff at me and say, carbs and brakes, corresponding to the various solvents used. So, of course, he smelled like the materials he was using. It left a sensible trace, could be sensed by the nose. That is to say, his day was imaginable to her. She could imagine what he was doing in his shop on the basis of what he smelled like, because he was working in the physical world. But while the filth and odors were apparent, the amount of head-scratching I'd done since breakfast was not. His wife would not be able to know what mental work he had done. And going back to Mike Rose again, who's writing about shop class, Mike Rose writes that in the practice of surgery, right, this is another physical trade, dichotomies such as concrete versus abstract technique, there was a breakdown in practice. The surgeon's judgment is simultaneously technical and deliberative, a mix of its source and its power. So a surgeon is, of course, somebody with a very considerable amount of book learning, and also one hopes a certain amount, or maybe a whole lot of, right, it's a physical job, a hand, working with one's hands. And that could be said, he's saying that a surgeon's job is somehow or another akin to or like the job of somebody who does motorcycle repair. needing to diagnose what has caused the problem and to figure out what the fix is. It's to identify symptoms, judge their likelihood, and rely upon his own sort of mental library of what could be the problem on the basis of what the symptoms are. So arguing that repairing motorcycles being akin to surgery, that the two of them are both actual intellectual endeavors. They're mental endeavors that happen to include, that do include the physical world. And after that, he is talking about, let me see, the social nature of owning a motorcycle repair shop comes in. And he talks about some of the specifics, Hondas, Phillips head screwdrivers, and in the diagnostic you have to develop your own decision tree for particular circumstances, the problem that is at each node of this tree. There comes a point when you have to step back and get a larger gestalt. Ooh, no, don't have a cigarette, have a ham sandwich. Or, okay, maybe a stalk of celery. Walk away, walk around the lift, right? Stop and think, scratch your head, he says, right? Think about what could possibly be the problem. Process it, maybe see it in your head. Maybe consider the variables, right? What could have caused it? He talks about his shopmate Tommy, who is an accomplished visual artist. And he's talking about, and we know this, right? People who can see things in their heads, who have a kind of a map into the way a machine might work, or an instrument, or any kind of device. The visual artist, able to see things in 3 dimensions that aren't actually in front of him, but to imagine the interior space of something that he's not himself inside. I had the conceit of being an empiricist, right? Like Aristotle, relying upon his senses. But seeing things is not a simple matter. Even on the relatively primitive vantage of bikes that were our specialty, some diagnostic situations contain so many variables, and symptoms can be undetermining of causes. Sometimes something that's identified by the owner of a motorcycle as a symptom is not related whatsoever to why the thing doesn't work. That explicit analytical reasoning comes up short. Okay. He has to rely sometimes on hunches rather than rules. And he claims there was more thinking going on in a bike shop than in a think tank. And then he goes on to talk about the social benefits. When people ask you what you do, if you say that you work at a think tank, that's kind of the end of the conversation. But if somebody asks you what you do and you say, oh, I own a motorcycle repair shop, he got immediate recognition. He was able to exchange services with machinists and metal fabricators, along the lines of doing favors for one another that were trade in nature. And that has a very different feel than transactions with money, when you can exchange services. So a machinist fixes an engine for you, and you repair a wheel for him, sort of thing. He also talks about socializing more broadly, not just within his own colleagues of repairmen, but 3 restaurants with cooks whose bikes he had restored, and where, unless I deceived myself, I was treated as a sage benefactor. If you ever walk into a shop and you're greeted warmly and you look at your plate versus other plate and get the feeling that maybe you got a few more French fries or something. I felt pride before my wife when we would go out to dinner and be given preferential treatment, maybe shown to the best table in the restaurant, or given an extra entree, or simply a hearty greeting. He talks about group rides, bike night, right, with the other motorcyclists. Sometimes some of the people that he was biking with would wear his shop's t-shirt. It felt good. and not in a way that working in a think tank would feel. Given the intrinsic richness, now he's opposing intrinsic with extrinsic. These are extrinsic benefits. The social benefits, because they're not involved in the repair of the bike itself. It's not simply looking at something and saying, yes, I've made that work, but it is it the extrinsic value, the social value of people seeing what he does and being pleased by what he does. But the intrinsic richness of manual work, right, the act of doing it itself, cognitively, socially, and in its broader psychic appeal. Then he asks the question, why has manual labor suffered such a devaluation in recent years as a component of education? Why isn't it valued anymore? Why isn't shop class valued anymore? Why is it disappearing? The economic rationale so often offered is namely that manual work is somehow going to disappear. But that's, as he says, questionable if not preposterous. Somebody still needs to repair somebody's motorcycle. So it's in the murky realm of culture. Right? Who is making the rational, the excuse that we don't need people to do manual labor? That's where we have to look, in the murky realm of culture, to find out why shop class is disappearing. And he says, to this end, perhaps we need to consider the origins of shop class so we can better understand its demise. So this is a transition into the third part. He is going to tell us about the origins of shop class.